Welcome back, MC Time Trackers. Today, we embark on a journey through history and language, where every story teaches you English, and every word carries the weight of time. This isn't just a lesson. It's an experience. As we explore the past, listen closely to the rhythm, the emotion, the voice of history itself. Because when you learn English through the stories of humanity, you're not just learning words, you're feeling the heartbeat of our shared past. So here's my challenge to you. Immerse yourself. Silence distractions. Let the language flow through you. Listen deeply. Repeat the sounds, the tone, the cadence. Learn not just meaning, but mastery. And if you can't finish this journey today, don't worry, history never leaves. It will be here, waiting for you. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another story that time forgot. Let's begin. The dawn of a new world. In 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail across the Atlantic and reached lands unknown to Europe. His voyage would ignite centuries of conquest and tragedy. Millions perished as the great empires of Europe, Spain, England, France, and others raced to claim the so-called New World. From the blood and ambition of these centuries would rise a new nation. Born on July 4, 1776, the United States of America. A land destined to wield power unseen since the days of Rome. Yet before any flag flew over this continent, the land already had its own story. For thousands of years, Native American civilizations flourished trading, governing, and waging wars across vast regions. Their societies were rich, complex, and deeply connected to the land long before any European ship crossed the horizon. Around the year 1000, Norse explorer Leif Erikson learned of a western land from sailor Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had been blown off course. Erikson sailed from Greenland, reaching the shores of what is now Newfoundland, and founded a small settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows. But within 2 decades, the Norse vanished, their wooden halls reclaimed by the wind. Nearly 5 centuries would pass before Europe would return. In October 1492, Columbus, an Italian under the Spanish crown, landed in the West Indies, believing he had reached Asia. His discovery opened an era of feverish exploration. The Florentine navigator Amerigo Vespucci, mapping the new continents, lent his name to them, America. What began in the Caribbean soon drew explorers northward toward the vast continent above. In 1497, Giovanni Caboto, known to the English as John Cabot, reached Newfoundland, unknowingly rediscovering the very land Erikson had found 500 years earlier. His journey earned England its first claim in North America. Soon after, Spanish adventurers like Juan Ponce de Leon and Hernando de Soto charted Florida and the American Southeast, while Frenchmen Jacques Cartier and Giovanni de Verrazzano mapped the St. Lawrence and the Atlantic coast. Wherever they went, they met the continent's first peoples, sometimes with open hands, often with bloodshed. Along with trade came new diseases, devastating native communities by the thousands. The dream of settlement soon followed. In 1585, the English tried to establish a colony on Roanoke Island, but starvation, disease, and conflict doomed the effort. When supply ships finally returned, the colony had vanished its fate, forever marked by a single word carved into a post: Croatoan. Thus was born the legend of the lost colony. Spain fared better. By 1565, they had founded St. Augustine, Florida, the first permanent European settlement in North America. The English tried again in 1607, founding Jamestown, Virginia under the London Company. It was a harsh beginning: disease, famine, and uncertainty plagued the settlers. Only under Captain John Smith's stern leadership did the colony begin to survive, aided by fragile peace with the Powhatan people. Jamestown endured and became the first successful English foothold in the New World. In 1619, a ship arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia, carrying 20 enslaved Africans, marking the beginning of more than 2 centuries of slavery on American soil. A year later, in 1620, the Pilgrims aboard the Mayflower landed at Plymouth, Massachusetts, seeking religious freedom. Before stepping ashore, they signed the Mayflower Compact, a simple promise of self-governance under the English crown. With help from the Wampanoag chief Massasoit and a native interpreter named Squanto, they endured their first brutal winter and celebrated the first Thanksgiving in the autumn of 1621. From these fragile beginnings, English colonies multiplied along the Atlantic coast. Trade with Europe flourished, towns grew into cities, and rival empires joined the race. The Dutch West India Company established New Amsterdam in 1624, purchasing the island of Manhattan for just $24. But its prosperity soon drew the eye of England. In 1664, 4 English frigates sailed into its harbor, demanding surrender. New Amsterdam fell and was reborn as New York. The seeds of a new world had been sown. On the edges of empire, through struggle, faith, and ambition, a nation's story had begun. Empires and conflicts, the battle for a continent. When the English seized New Amsterdam from the Dutch in 1664, not a drop of blood was shed. Yet that quiet transfer sparked the Second Anglo-Dutch War. By June 1665, the city was absorbed under English law and reborn as New York City. Spain, whose early voyages had granted it mastery over the Caribbean and South America, expanded northward from Saint-Tine, Augustine, pressing through the American Southeast, the Midwest, and into the vast western lands. By the end of the 17th century, its empire stretched across the heart of North America. France, England's old rival, carved its own dominion along the St. Lawrence River, founding Quebec, Trois-Rivières, and Montreal, chasing a dream of reaching the Pacific. Their influence deepened as the fur trade flourished and, in 1718, the French founded New Orleans, their glittering gateway to the Mississippi and the crown jewel of their continental empire. But beneath these imperial ambitions burned an older struggle. Native tribes pressured, displaced, and divided fought to preserve their world. In 1675, the colonies of New England erupted in King Philip's War after failed diplomacy with the Wampanoag. Metacom, son of Massasoit, who had once aided the Pilgrims, now rose against them. Raids swept across villages and towns. With no royal army to protect them, colonial militias struck back with brutal vengeance. By 1676, Metacom was killed, his people scattered, and entire tribes destroyed, the bloodiest conflict North America had yet seen. The ashes of that war bred new tensions. Northern tribes, fearing English expansion, formed the Wabanaki Confederation, aligning with the French. When Europe's rivalries flared again, the colonies followed suit. In 1689, King William's War set English-backed Iroquois against French-backed Wabanaki. For nearly a decade, the frontier burned Boston for the French, Quebec for the English, yet neither fell. The peace of 1697 was uneasy and brief. Europe's dynastic chaos soon spilled across the ocean. The death of King Charles II of Spain in 1701 plunged Europe into the War of Spanish Succession, known in America as Queen Anne's War. From the forests of New England to the swamps of Florida, English and French colonies fought through native allies and colonial militias. Raids consumed settlements, and the Wabanaki, again siding with France, ravaged the Massachusetts Bay Colony. After 13 years, the fighting left the continent scarred. France ceded Acadia, Newfoundland, and the Hudson River Valley to England, while countless native communities lay shattered. For nearly 30 years, a fragile peace followed. The colonies prospered farms, shipyards, and markets spread along the coast, feeding a thriving transatlantic economy. Yet this prosperity was bound to human suffering. The triangular trade chained 3 continents together. Slaves from Africa were sold in the Americas, ships carried sugar and molasses north, and rum, tobacco, and cotton returned across the sea. Between 1,600 and 1,775, over 2 million enslaved Africans were brought to the New World. Their forced labor powered an empire's wealth. By the 1,732nd, imperial jealousy again flared. The British bristled at Spanish control of trade in the Caribbean and South America, while Spain accused Britain of violating its territorial claims north of Florida. In 1731, a Spanish patrol boarded the British brig Rebecca off Cuba. Its captain, Robert Jenkins, claimed the Spaniards cut off his ear. When he displayed it before Parliament, outrage ignited. In 1739, Britain declared the War of Jenkins' Ear. Most battles raged in the Caribbean, though skirmishes along the Georgia-Florida frontier brought ruin to native allies on both sides. Before that war had even ended, Europe erupted once more. The death of Emperor Charles VI of Austria in 1740 triggered the War of Austrian Succession, or King George's War in America. France and England turned their colonial fury north again. In 1745, British forces captured Fortress Louisbourg at the mouth of the Sand. Lawrence, one of their few victories in 50 years. But when peace came in 1748, the fort was handed back to France, enraging the colonists who had bled for it. The treaties changed little. Borders blurred, hatreds lingered, and the wilderness between empires remained contested. Then, in 1753, Virginia's Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie sent a young officer, George Washington, to challenge French forts in the Ohio River Valley. When the French refused, Washington returned with orders to drive them out by force. By April 1754, the French captured a small British outpost and built in its place a powerful bastion, Fort Duquesne. The uneasy peace of empires was broken once more, and a young George Washington had just fired the first sparks of what would soon become the French and Indian War. The fires of rebellion. In the summer of 1754, deep in the Ohio Valley, Colonel George Washington and his small band of colonial militia, joined by native allies, came upon a camp of unsuspecting French soldiers. A brief, chaotic battle followed. The French, who claimed to be on a diplomatic mission, were swiftly overpowered. But when the wounded French commander surrendered, a native chief allied to Washington, Tenacharisan, suddenly struck him down, an act born of long-standing hatred toward the French. The killing horrified Washington, who hastily built a makeshift fort he called Fort Necessity. Soon, French forces from Fort Duquesne surrounded it. Outnumbered and rain-soaked, Washington was forced to surrender. It was a small clash, but one that would ignite a global inferno. Across the Atlantic, Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie called for reinforcements. Britain, determined to assert its claim over the Ohio Valley, dispatched troops to strike at French forts stretching across the Sante, Lawrence River, and into Canada. France responded in kind. By 1756, the conflict in the American frontier had merged into the 7 Years' War, a worldwide struggle spanning Europe, India, the Caribbean, and Asia. At first, Fortune favored France. British expeditions into Canada collapsed in disaster. Forts such as Ticonderoga and William Henry fell. Yet by 1758, momentum shifted. Britain's mighty navy cut French supply lines, and a new generation of colonial fighters joined the fray. The British captured Fort Niagara, Louisbourg, and finally, the beating heart of New France, Quebec. By 1760, General Jeffrey Amherst secured the French governor's surrender, ending the war in North America. The global conflict raged on until 1763, when the Treaty of Paris was signed. The cost had been staggering, over 1.4 million casualties worldwide, 23,000 of them in the French and Indian War alone. France's power in North America was broken. Britain now held Canada, the lands east of the Mississippi, and vast Caribbean territories. The war had made Britain an empire beyond measure, but also deeply in debt. And in her American colonies, new ideas were stirring. Throughout the 18th century, the colonies had grown from 250,000 settlers in 1700 to over 1.25 million by 1750. The raw goods they produced, iron, hemp, tar, copper, fed the British war machine and fueled its navy. Yet prosperity bred independence. The colonists saw themselves as loyal subjects, but also as a people apart, self-reliant, Protestant, and free. During these turbulent years, a wave of spiritual renewal swept across the colonies. The Great Awakening, a vast evangelical revival, rekindled faith and unity among settlers divided by distance and fear. Traveling preachers spoke of salvation and rebirth. Among them, George Whitefield was unmatched. His booming sermons drew tens of thousands. In Boston, 1740, over 30,000 came to hear him preach, nearly twice the city's population. The revival bound the colonies with a shared moral vision that would one day fuel revolution. But peace did not last. The Proclamation of 1763, issued by King George III, forbade settlement west of the Appalachians to avoid conflict with native tribes. Colonists, who believed they had fought for that very land, ignored the decree. Tension simmered. To pay off its crushing war debts, Britain imposed new taxes, the Sugar Act of 1764, followed by the Stamp Act of 1765, requiring official stamps on printed materials, contracts, and even playing cards. For the first time, Parliament had taxed the colonies directly. Outrage swept through the settlements. No taxation without representation became the cry of resistance. Protest turned to defiance. Secret groups called the Sons of Liberty harassed tax collectors and burned stamped paper. Riots broke out, homes of royal officials were ransacked, including that of Thomas Hutchinson, Massachusetts lieutenant governor. But the resistance also moved to the halls of debate. In 1765, delegates from 9 colonies met in New York City for the Stamp Act Congress, declaring that taxation without consent violated their rights as Englishmen. Their boycott of British goods crippled imports, and in 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. Yet even in repeal, Britain asserted authority through the Declaratory Act, claiming full power in all cases whatsoever. Both sides believed they had won a victory. Neither realized they had opened a wound that could not heal. Economic strain soon returned. In 1767, the Townshend Acts placed new taxes on glass, paper, and tea. Anger spread once again. What had begun as a quarrel over policy was becoming something deeper, a clash of identity, of principle, of freedom itself. And somewhere in the colonies, in the quiet between sermons and protests, a new nation was beginning to take shape. The spark of revolution. In 1767, as the British Empire strained under the weight of its debts, Charles Townshend, Chancellor of the Exchequer, introduced a series of 5 laws that would bear his name, the Townshend Acts. Before his death the following year, Townshend warned Parliament that the measures might provoke rebellion in America. He was right. The acts taxed glass, lead, paint, paper, and most infamously, tea. They created a new customs board in Boston, strengthened royal authority over colonial trade, and stripped local courts of power. The New York Assembly was even suspended for refusing to comply with the Quartering Act. To the colonists, these were not just taxes, they were a declaration of dominance. Across the colonies, outrage spread like wildfire. Pamphlets, letters, and broadsides filled the streets. Farmers, lawyers, and merchants alike took up the pen to denounce Parliament's overreach. The Sons of Liberty revived their boycotts, their meetings growing more defiant with each passing day. In Boston, mobs formed, and customs officers fled for safety. When the Crown sent redcoats to restore order, tension boiled into bloodshed. On the cold night of March 5, 1770, a lone British sentry outside the Boston Customs House faced an angry crowd. Snowballs turned to stones, shouts turned to fury. As Captain Thomas Preston and his men arrived to back the soldier, the mob swelled to hundreds. A musket went off, no one knew who fired first. In seconds, the troops unleashed a ragged volley into the crowd. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead, among them Crispus Attucks, a former slave. The Boston Massacre, as patriots called it, echoed across the colonies. The Sons of Liberty seized upon the tragedy as proof of tyranny, while lawyer John Adams, though no friend of British rule, defended the soldiers in court. "Facts are stubborn things," he told the jury. Adams won acquittal for most, arguing that law, not passion, must rule. But the damage was done. The bond between colony and crown had begun to tear. 3 years later, as Britain reeled from a banking crisis, Parliament once again turned to America for relief. The Tea Act of 1773 allowed the East India Company to ship tea directly to the colonies duty-free while taxing rival Dutch tea. It made tea cheaper, but not fairer. To many, it was another insult, a symbol of Parliament's power over their lives. On December 16, 1773, disguised as Mohawk warriors, the Sons of Liberty boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 crates of tea into the icy water, an act of defiance worth 9,659 pounds, or more than $1.7 million today. The Boston Tea Party had begun. Parliament's response was swift and brutal. In 1774, it passed the Intolerable Acts, a set of laws designed to punish Massachusetts and crush rebellion. The Boston Port Act closed the harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Government Act placed the colony under direct royal control. The Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England, and the renewed Quartering Act forced colonists to house British troops. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, these acts united the colonies. In September 1774, delegates gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, drafting petitions and boycotts. When their plea to King George III went unanswered, the colonies convened again in May 1775, but this time, rebellion was already at their doorstep. On the night of April 18, 1775, Paul Revere and William Dawes rode through the moonlit countryside shouting, "The British are coming!" British troops marched from Boston toward Concord to seize hidden arms. At dawn on April 19th, On the village green of Lexington, colonial militiamen stood their ground. A single shot cracked the morning air, the shot heard round the world. When the smoke lifted, 8 colonists were dead, and the war for American independence had begun. The battles that followed were fought not for revolution, but for rights the colonists believed were theirs as Englishmen. Yet blood changes everything. In June 1775, as the Second Continental Congress met again, delegates voted to form a Continental Army. The man chosen to lead it was a tall Virginian with quiet resolve, George Washington. Once a colonial officer who had served Britain faithfully during the French and Indian War, Washington had been denied a commission by the Crown. Now, a decade later, he would take command, not for Britain, but against it. In the fields around Boston, red and blue smoke rose as the British captured Bunker Hill at a terrible cost. It was clear to both sides the colonies would not submit, and England would not relent. The age of empire was ending. The age of revolution had begun. The birth of a nation. In the summer of 1775, after a unanimous vote from the Second Continental Congress, George Washington mounted his horse and rode north toward Boston. His task was monumental, to forge from chaos a single army. What he found was less a military and more a gathering of strangers, hungry, poorly clothed, and divided by region. The soldiers of the Continental Army quarreled as often as they trained. Washington himself once broke up a violent brawl, a snowball fight turned riot between men from Massachusetts and Virginia. To unite them was its own kind of war. Through the brutal winter of 1775-76, the struggle took 2 fronts. In the north, Generals Benedict Arnold and Richard Montgomery led a doomed invasion of Quebec. Montgomery was killed, Arnold wounded, and disease finished the rest. Around Boston, Washington held fast, besieging 11,000 British troops trapped within the city. He lacked heavy guns, so he sent Colonel Henry Knox on an impossible mission to haul artillery from Fort Ticonderoga across frozen mountains. Against all odds, Knox succeeded. In March 1776, the guns appeared on Dorchester Heights, staring down the city. On March 17, the British evacuated. Boston was free. The war now spread across the colonies. Fighting raged in the Carolinas, in New York, and along the Canadian frontier. Washington, ordered to defend New York City, knew the danger his army was untrained, and he had no navy. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, Congress moved beyond pleas for peace. The Olive Branch petition had been rejected, and Britain had declared the colonists traitors. A new conviction was taking hold. Reconciliation was impossible. In June 1776, Congress appointed a committee to declare independence. Thomas Jefferson drafted the document, its words plain, yet immortal. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Adopted on July 2, ratified on July 4, the Declaration of Independence transformed rebellion into revolution. Washington had it read to his troops in New York. At last, they knew what they were fighting for. But freedom had a price. In August 1776, the British struck New York with overwhelming force. Washington's men were driven from the city in a series of defeats, retreating through New Jersey and across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. The Revolution trembled on the edge of collapse. On Christmas night, December 25, Washington crossed the Delaware through an icy storm. At Trenton, he surprised a Hessian garrison and won his first victory. Within days, he struck again at Princeton, turning despair into hope. These winter triumphs kept the Revolution alive. In 1777, the British captured Philadelphia. But in the North, fortune shifted. At Saratoga, New York, General John Burgoyne's entire army, nearly 7,000 men, surrendered to Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. It was the first great American victory, and the world took notice. By 1778, France formally allied with the United States, declaring war on Britain and transforming the rebellion into a global conflict. That winter, Washington's army endured Valley Forge, hunger, disease, and bitter cold. Yet from suffering came strength. Foreign officers like the Marquis de Lafayette and Baron von Steuben trained the troops in the art of European warfare. When spring came, Washington met the British at Monmouth, New Jersey. The battle ended in a stalemate, but for the first time, the Continental Army stood toe-to-toe with Britain's best. Realizing the North was lost, Britain turned south. From Savannah to Charleston, their armies struck hard, winning battles but losing hearts. Patriot partisans under Nathanael Greene and others harassed their supply lines, bleeding them dry. In 1781, General Charles Cornwallis, cornered at Yorktown, found himself surrounded by combined American and French forces. After weeks of siege, he surrendered his army. The world's mightiest empire had been humbled by its own colonies. Peace talks began, and after 2 long years, the Treaty of Paris, 1783, recognized the United States of America as free and independent. But victory brought new trials. The Articles of Confederation, adopted in 1777, had bound the states loosely for war, but offered little power for peace. Each state governed itself. Disputes over trade, borders, and taxes soon threatened the fragile Union. The young republic had survived the sword, now it would have to survive itself. In the ashes of empire, a new world was being born, not by kings or conquest, but by the enduring will of a people who dared to be free. The struggle for stability. Less than 10 years after independence, the young United States found itself in turmoil. The war was over, but peace brought a different kind of battle, one fought with debt, disillusion, and desperation. In the autumn of 1786, anger erupted in Massachusetts. Crushed by taxes and foreclosures, unpaid Revolutionary War veterans led by Daniel Shays marched on Springfield, blocking the courts that ordered the seizure of their farms. The rebels, farmers, fathers, and soldiers turned their muskets on the very government they had helped create. The uprising failed, but it shook the nation. It revealed what many already feared. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government was powerless to act. Beyond America's borders, the weakness was plain. The Treaty of Paris, 1783, had promised that British creditors would be repaid and Loyalist property restored. Yet states enforced the terms unevenly, and British troops still occupied forts deep in American territory. The nation that had defied an empire could not even enforce its own peace. It was clear that change was needed. In May 1787, delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia for what would become the Constitutional Convention. The Articles of Confederation were beyond repair. What emerged instead was a new design, a government of checks and balances, divided into 3 branches. The legislative branch, or Congress, would write the laws. The House of Representatives, elected by population, would share power with the Senate, where each state had 2 votes. Together, they could levy taxes, declare war, and shape the nation's destiny. The executive branch, led by a president, would enforce those laws, command the military, guide foreign policy, and ensure the republic's survival. And the judicial branch, embodied in the Supreme Court, would interpret the laws and, in time, assert the power to strike them down, when unconstitutional, a principle later affirmed in Marbury v. Madison 1803. It was a government not of kings or classes, but, as the preamble declared, of the people, by the people, for the people. In September 1787, the Constitution was presented to Congress not as an amendment to the old order, but as a complete rebirth. The fight for ratification began at once. In the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay argued passionately for the new system. Their opponents, the anti-federalists, warned that it gave too much power to the central government. Yet one by one, the states agreed. On June 21, 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the Constitution, and the United States was reborn. When the first national election came in 1789, the choice was unanimous. George Washington, hero of the Revolution, became the nation's first president. John Adams became vice president. Washington formed a cabinet of brilliant, often opposing minds, Jefferson, Hamilton, Knox, and Randolph, and began the work of governing a fragile republic. With Hamilton's financial genius, the government created a national bank, assumed state debts, and established credit abroad. Washington chose the site for a permanent capital, the District of Columbia, a city that would bear his name. But unity was short-lived. When Western farmers rebelled against a tax on whiskey in 1794, Washington himself led troops to put down the Whiskey Rebellion, proving that this new government could and would enforce its laws. Abroad, the world was changing again. Revolution swept France, once America's ally, and war engulfed Europe. Washington steered a course of neutrality, warning that foreign entanglements could destroy the republic before it matured. In 1795, the Jay Treaty restored peace with Britain, angering pro-French Americans but securing vital trade. In 1797, Washington stepped down after 2 terms, setting the precedent for every president who followed. He might have ruled for life. Instead, he chose the higher legacy of restraint. His successor, John Adams, inherited a divided nation. France's new revolutionary government clashed with American ships in the Quasi-War, while the Alien and Sedition Acts eroded freedoms at home. Adams' popularity fell, but he kept the peace and left office quietly, as Washington had before him. Then came Thomas Jefferson, elected in 1800, who vowed to restore simplicity and liberty. He reduced debt, cut taxes, and disbanded parts of the Army and Navy. Yet his greatest act would expand the nation itself. In 1803, Jefferson purchased Louisiana from Napoleon Bonaparte, doubling America's size. A year later, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, guided by Sacagawea, set out to chart the vast frontier, meeting over 70 native tribes and mapping a continent's heart. Jefferson's vision opened the West, but the world beyond remained perilous. The Napoleonic Wars raged, and both Britain and France preyed upon American ships. Jefferson's embargo of 1807 meant to protect neutrality, strangled trade instead. The nation that had once fought for freedom was learning what it truly meant to preserve it. From war to westward dreams. When Thomas Jefferson left office, the nation was weary of embargoes and tension. Yet his chosen successor, James Madison, won the presidency in 1808, inheriting a country divided at home and humiliated abroad. Britain and France continued to seize American ships, dragging sailors into foreign navies. Madison at first clung to Jefferson's failed embargo, but the pressure for action mounted. In Congress, fiery young nationalists known as the War Hawks, led by Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, demanded war. Reports spread that British agents were arming native tribes along the frontier. When a British ship fired on an American vessel just off the coast, Madison could wait no longer. On June 1st, 1812, he asked Congress to declare war on Great Britain. The War of 1812 began in confusion. The young republic was unprepared, its army small, its navy tiny. 3 invasions of Canada failed miserably. Yet at sea, America surprised the world. The USS Constitution, nicknamed Old Ironsides, seemed invincible. British cannonballs bounced from her thick oak hull as she shattered enemy ships one after another. In the west, Tecumseh, the visionary Shawnee chief, forged a confederation of tribes to resist American expansion. Allied with the British, he fought bravely until his death at the Battle of the Thames in 1813. With him died the last great hope for a united native resistance. 2 years later, the British struck back. In August 1814, they landed troops near Washington, D.C., and routed the defending militia. President Madison fled as British forces entered the capital. First Lady Dolly Madison, refusing to abandon the White House, ordered the rescue of Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington before escaping the flames. That night, British troops burned the Capitol, the Treasury, and the White House until a sudden hurricane tore through the city, extinguishing the fires and wrecking the British fleet. The war turned at Baltimore, where Fort McHenry endured a fierce bombardment through the night of September 13, 1814. When dawn broke, the giant Star-Spangled Banner still waved above the fort. Inspired, lawyer Francis Scott Key wrote a poem that became the anthem of a nation reborn. The final battle came far to the south. In January 1815, unaware that peace had already been signed in Ghent, British troops attacked New Orleans. General Andrew Jackson, commanding a ragtag force of militia, free black soldiers, pirates, and frontiersmen, repelled the assault with staggering losses to the enemy. Though fought after the treaty, the Battle of New Orleans became a symbol of American resolve and Jackson its hero. The Treaty of Ghent restored pre-war boundaries, but its meaning was far greater. For the first time, the United States had faced the British Empire and survived. The world now saw the young republic not as an experiment, but as a nation here to stay. With the war's end came a surge of optimism. The British had abandoned their native allies, leaving the tribes defenseless against American expansion. Across the continent, settlers dreamed of a destiny that stretched from sea to shining sea. In 1823, President James Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine, warning Europe that the Western Hemisphere was closed to colonization. America, he declared, would stand guard over its own hemisphere. Soon came the fever of manifest destiny, the belief that expansion was divine and inevitable. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson, forced more than 60,000 Native Americans west of the Mississippi. Thousands perished on the Trail of Tears, their homelands seized by settlers. Meanwhile, pioneers pushed westward on perilous routes like the Oregon Trail, facing disease, hunger, and attack. Families left everything behind in search of land and freedom. The Mormon faithful, driven by persecution, made their own exodus to Salt Lake Valley in 1847. Others chased wealth. In 1848, gold was discovered in California, igniting the greatest migration in American history. The gold rush of 1849 transformed the West overnight. San Francisco's population exploded from hundreds to tens of thousands. Fortune seekers, The 49ers flooded the mountains, tearing rivers for gold dust. Merchants and speculators profited most, but for a brief, glittering moment, the world believed that America's promise could be panned from a stream. By the 1,850 seconds, the United States had stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But beneath the triumph of expansion ran deep shadows of broken treaties, enslaved labor, and the coming storm that would soon test whether the nation, so boldly built, could endure. The gathering storm. As America expanded westward, the need for speed, for connection, grew desperate. In 1860, a daring enterprise called the Pony Express was born. Horsemen raced across the plains from Missouri to California, changing mounts at relay stations and riding through the night. They carried mail over 2,000 miles in only 10 days. The service lasted just 18 months, ended by the transcontinental telegraph in 1861, yet in that short time it bound California to the Union and became a symbol of courage on the frontier. But expansion had its cost. As settlers surged west, native tribes resisted fiercely. The U.S. Army built a chain of forts across the plains and deserts, fighting a series of brutal frontier wars that would last for decades. Farther south, the lands of Texas were changing hands. Once part of Spanish Mexico, the region passed to the Mexican Republic in 1824. To populate the sparsely settled territory, Mexico invited immigrants from the United States, offering land and freedom. Thousands came and brought slavery with them. When Mexico outlawed slavery in 1829, tensions flared. Immigration was banned, but the Anglos ignored the law and soon outnumbered the native-born Mexicans. By 1835, when Antonio López de Santa Anna seized control of Mexico and imposed dictatorship, both Anglo settlers and local Tejanos rose in revolt. In February 1836, Santa Anna's army surrounded a small mission in San Antonio the Alamo. Inside, fewer than 300 defenders held out for 13 days before being overrun. William Travis, James Bowie, and Davy Crockett were among those slain. "Remember the Alamo" became the cry of vengeance that carried the Texan army to victory weeks later at San Jacinto, where Santa Anna was captured and Texas won its independence. The new Republic of Texas quickly sought annexation by the United States. Despite fierce debate over adding another slave state, Congress approved it in 1845. The move outraged Mexico, which still claimed Texas as its own. When border disputes erupted along the Rio Grande, President James K. Polk sent troops, and when shots were fired, he declared that American blood has been shed on American soil. The Mexican-American War began. From 1846 to 1848, U.S. forces swept through Mexico, capturing California, New Mexico, and even Mexico City. Poorly equipped and divided, the Mexican army collapsed. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo forced Mexico to surrender half its territory, land that would become California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Texas. It was a stunning triumph for American ambition and a stark reminder of the power of manifest destiny. Yet that destiny carried moral peril. As new territories joined the Union, one question consumed the nation: would slavery follow? The fragile balance between free and slave states teetered. Compromises from Missouri, 1,820, to California, 1,850, only delayed the inevitable clash. The Underground Railroad grew in secret, helping enslaved people escape north. Among its bravest conductors was Harriet Tubman, who freed more than 70 souls at unimaginable risk. But for every act of courage, anger boiled in the South. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed settlers to decide slavery by popular sovereignty. The result was chaos. Bleeding Kansas, as pro-slavery and abolitionist settlers, turned the territory into a battlefield. Out of this violence emerged John Brown, a fiery abolitionist who believed only blood could purge America's sin. After slaughtering slaveholders in Kansas, he led a failed raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in 1859, hoping to ignite a slave uprising. Captured by U.S. troops under Colonel Robert E. Lee, Brown was executed for treason and became a martyr to the anti-slavery cause. By now, the nation was breaking apart. The Missouri Compromise had unraveled. Politics turned poisonous. In 1856, Congressman Preston Brooks savagely beat Senator Charles Sumner on the Senate floor, cheered by Southern supporters. North and South spoke not as one people, but as enemies. The crisis reached its final stage with the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln, a lawyer from Illinois, ran as the Republican candidate on a platform of free labor, national unity, and the expansion of railroads, but above all, opposition to the spread of slavery. His victory was peaceful, but the reaction was not. In December 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. Within weeks, 6 more Southern states followed, forming the Confederate States of America under Jefferson Davis. President James Buchanan watched helplessly as federal forts fell into rebel hands. When Lincoln took office in March 1861, he faced a choice between war and surrender. He refused to yield. When he sent a ship carrying food, not weapons, to the Union garrison at Fort Sumter, Confederate guns opened fire on April 12, 1861. The bombardment roared for 34 hours. Not a single Union soldier died, but when the flag came down, the nation's fate was sealed. The Union had fallen apart, and America marched to war with itself. Reunion and Reconstruction. The thunder of cannon at Fort Sumter had barely faded when the Union rallied behind Abraham Lincoln. Northern states that had wavered, New Jersey, Delaware, even parts of Maryland, now pledged their loyalty to the flag. Lincoln seized the momentum, calling for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion and restore the Union. The response was overwhelming. In Ohio alone, enough men enlisted to fill the entire quota themselves. In the South, Lincoln's call to arms had the opposite effect. Seeing it as proof that the North meant to subjugate them by force, 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, joined the Confederacy. The die was cast. What had begun as a political rift had become a war for the nation's soul. At the center of that struggle lay one question: slavery. Lincoln's goal was reunion, not abolition, at least at first, but both sides understood what was at stake. If the Union triumphed, slavery would not survive. The aging General Winfield Scott, hero of earlier wars, devised the North's first grand strategy, the Anaconda Plan, a naval blockade to choke the South's trade and strangle its economy. In the West, the Union would seize control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in 2. The South, with little industry and few ships, could only hope for quick victories, perhaps on northern soil, that might earn them recognition from Britain or France. But those nations, having abolished slavery, would never openly side with the Confederacy. Early Confederate successes gave hope. In the East, Robert E. Lee, once offered command of Union forces, became the Confederacy's most brilliant commander. His victories over hesitant Northern generals kept the South alive. In the West, a determined Union officer named Ulysses S. Grant began carving his own legend. His relentless campaigns captured Forts Henry and Donelson, then the vital fortress of Vicksburg in July 1863, securing the Mississippi for the Union. At the same time, Lee invaded Pennsylvania, hoping a decisive victory would shatter Northern morale. Instead, in the rolling hills of Gettysburg, he met defeat after 3 brutal days in July 1863. With Grant's triumph at Vicksburg and Lee's retreat from Gettysburg, the high tide of the Confederacy broke. Months earlier, after the bloody Battle of Antietam in 1862, Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in rebel territories forever free. It transformed the war's meaning from a fight to preserve the Union into a crusade for human liberty. Thousands of black men joined the Union ranks as the newly formed U.S. colored troops, proving their courage in battles across the South. By 1864, Lincoln had elevated Grant to command all Union armies. Grant hammered Lee's forces in Virginia, while his trusted general, William Tecumseh Sherman, marched through Georgia, burning Atlanta and cutting a swath of destruction to the sea. By Christmas, Sherman telegraphed Lincoln, "I beg to present you the city of Savannah as a gift." In the spring of 1865, cornered at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered his army to Grant on April 9th. The Civil War, 4 years of carnage, over 600,000 dead, was finally over. Days later, Congress ratified the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery forever. But triumph turned to tragedy. On the evening of April 14th, 1865, Lincoln was shot by actor John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. He died the next morning, the first American president to be assassinated. The nation plunged into mourning as his dream of peaceful reunion fell to his successor, Andrew Johnson. Reconstruction began under Union occupation. The defeated South was divided into 5 military districts, each overseen by federal troops enforcing new laws. Congress passed 2 more constitutional amendments. The 14th, granting citizenship and equal protection to all born in the U.S., and the 15th, securing the right to vote regardless of race. Yet, hatred festered. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan rose in the shadows, terrorizing freedmen and their allies. In 1868, Ulysses S. Grant, the Union's greatest general, became the 18th president. He used federal power to crush the Klan and protect civil rights, creating the Justice Department to enforce the new amendments. But corruption and political fatigue weakened his administration. By the mid-1870s, the North's will to reconstruct the South began to fade. The contested election of 1876 ended in compromise. The presidency would go to Rutherford B. Hayes, and in return, federal troops would withdraw from the South. In 1877, Reconstruction was officially over. The promises of freedom and equality were left to languish in the face of Jim Crow and segregation. Even as the nation turned inward, new horizons opened to the West. The Transcontinental Railroad, begun in 1863 under Lincoln's vision, was completed in 1869 at Promontory Summit, Utah, where a golden spike joined east to west. What once took months could now be crossed in less than a week. Settlers, dreamers, and outlaws followed the rails into a new frontier, a land of promise and peril. In these restless years, the Wild West was born a place of gunslingers, gamblers, and legends. In Tombstone, Arizona, lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday faced down the Clanton Gang in the 30-second gunfight at the OK Corral, immortalizing an age of dust and defiance. By century's end, America stood transformed, a nation reunited, industrialized, and surging toward modernity. But beneath its golden surface, the scars of war and inequality remained reminders that freedom, once won, must still be kept. The Gilded Age. Prosperity and paradox. When the contested election of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden ended, compromise gave the presidency to Hayes and ended Reconstruction. Federal troops withdrew from the South, abandoning the fragile protections once afforded to freedmen. What followed was an era of systemic oppression, violence, and disenfranchisement that would last for more than a century, the age of Jim Crow. In the defeated South, freedom came without equality. With few opportunities beyond sharecropping or domestic labor, many Black Americans were bound once again to the land they had once tilled as slaves. The promises of emancipation faded beneath the weight of poverty and racial terror. Yet elsewhere, the nation was booming. Between 1877 and 1900, more than 7 million immigrants arrived, drawn by cheap land and high wages. First came the Irish, Germans, and Chinese. Later, waves of Italians, Jews, and Eastern Europeans crowded into America's cities. But with this diversity came fear. Many white Protestants saw the newcomers as threats to their culture and jobs. Mobs attacked Chinese workers in the West, and by 1892, Congress had passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, America's first major law banning immigration by race, later made permanent in 1902. The government, eager to populate the plains, granted millions of acres to railroads and settlers through the Homestead Act of 1862. Immigrants and families from the East rushed to claim farmland once belonging to native tribes. Technology, new steel plows, and mechanical reapers made large-scale farming possible, but it also flooded markets. By 1898, America's output had soared. Wheat up 256%, coal 800%, and rail lines stretched more than 167,000 miles. Yet farmers reaped little reward. Falling prices and debt led to unrest, fueling the rise of the populist movement, a cry against monopoly and political corruption. The true heart of the Gilded Age was the railroad, an iron artery that carried the nation's wealth. Nearly 800,000 workers labored for the railways by 1890, often under brutal conditions. Mechanization replaced skilled workers with cheaper, unskilled labor, widening the gulf between rich and poor. By century's end, the top 10% of Americans owned over 3/4 of the nation's wealth. This inequality erupted into violent conflict. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 lasted nearly 2 months, paralyzing the nation and leaving more than 100 dead before federal troops restored order. In 1886, a protest for workers' rights in Chicago's Haymarket Square turned deadly when a bomb exploded among police, sparking panic and killing 7 officers. 8 labor leaders were convicted in a controversial trial, martyrs to some, radicals to others. Unrest flared again during the Pullman strike of 1894, when wage cuts and rent hikes drove railroad workers to rebellion. The strike spread across 27 states, halting train traffic and leading to violent clashes with federal troops. Under pressure, President Grover Cleveland declared Labor Day a national holiday to appease the working class, even as public sympathy turned against the largely immigrant strikers. While workers struggled, the captains of industry rose. John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and J.P. Morgan built empires of oil, steel, rail, and finance men, celebrated as industrial titans, yet condemned as robber barons. Their fortunes reshaped the nation, even as millions labored in poverty beneath them. Outrage found its voice in the muckrakers journalists who exposed corruption. Upton Sinclair's 1906 novel The Jungle revealed the horrors of the meatpacking industry, spurring food safety laws. Ida Tarbell's searing expose on Standard Oil led to its breakup as a monopoly. And photographer Jacob Riis, in How the Other Half Lives 1890, shocked readers with haunting images of New York slums, prompting long overdue housing reform. The Gilded Age was a time of dazzling contrasts. Beneath glittering wealth, cities teemed with tenements, disease, and despair. Yet the same years saw astonishing progress. Electric lights, telegraphs, streetcars, and skyscrapers. In 1879, Thomas Edison's light bulb illuminated the world. 4 years later, the Brooklyn Bridge, a masterpiece of engineering, spanned the East River, linking Manhattan to Brooklyn. Designed by John Roebling and completed by his son Washington with the crucial help of Emily Roebling, one of the first women to oversee such a project, the bridge stood as a monument to human will and innovation. Still, progress had its price. The Panic of 1893, triggered by overbuilt railroads and collapsing banks, plunged the nation into depression. Unemployment soared, businesses failed, and hunger stalked the streets. President Cleveland, already weakened by his handling of the Pullman strike, saw his party crushed in the elections that followed. By 1896, the nation was ready for change. The Democrats, led by fiery populist William Jennings Bryan, championed the working man but lost to the Republican William McKinley, who promised stability and prosperity. The Gilded Age closed as it began a nation of extremes, torn between innovation and inequality, power and poverty. When McKinley was assassinated in 1901, his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, the young Rough Rider, stepped into the White House. His arrival marked the dawn of a new era, the Progressive Age. When reformers would seek to tame the giants the Gilded Age had unleashed. A new century and a new empire. By the end of the 19th century, America had fulfilled its long-cherished manifest destiny. The nation stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, united by iron rails and a shared sense of triumph. Having survived Civil War and Reconstruction, the United States now looked outward beyond its borders to test its growing strength on the world stage. The first step lay across the Pacific, in the Hawaiian Islands, an independent kingdom ruled by the Kamehameha dynasty since the late 1700s. Though the U.S. had formally recognized Hawaiian sovereignty in 1846, American planters gradually seized control of the island's economy through vast sugar plantations. By 1887, U.S.-born settlers forced King Kalakaua to sign the so-called Bayonet Constitution, stripping him of power and placing the kingdom under the sway of foreign businessmen. When Queen Liliuokalani ascended the throne in 1891, she sought to restore Hawaiian authority. Her plans for reform alarmed the American elites, who formed a Committee of Safety and staged a coup in 1893. Backed by the U.S. Navy at Pearl Harbor. President Grover Cleveland condemned the act as illegal, but the damage was done. The Queen was overthrown, and by 1894, the Republic of Hawaii was declared under Sanford B. Dole. Within a few years, annexation by the United States was inevitable. Meanwhile, the Caribbean boiled with rebellion. On the island of Cuba, insurgents rose against Spanish rule. Reports of Spain's brutal crackdowns filled American newspapers, stoking outrage. Then, on February 15th, 1898, the U.S. battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 268 sailors. "Remember the Maine" became the nation's rallying cry. Though Spain denied involvement, Public fury pushed President William McKinley to act. In April 1898, the United States declared war, a short, decisive conflict remembered as the Spanish-American War. The first shots were fired not in the Caribbean, but in Asia. On May 1st, Commodore George Dewey's fleet annihilated the Spanish Navy at Manila Bay in the Philippines, losing fewer than 10 men. Meanwhile, U.S. forces landed in Cuba. Among them were the Rough Riders, a volunteer cavalry led by Theodore Roosevelt. Charging up San Juan Hill, they helped secure victory at Santiago, where the U.S. fleet destroyed Spain's final Caribbean squadron. By August, the war was over a splendid little war, as future Secretary of State John Hay called it. The Treaty of Paris, signed December 10, 1898, ended Spain's empire. Cuba was freed, while Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines were ceded to the United States. But the new empire came at a cost. In 1899, Filipino revolutionaries who had fought Spain now turned against their new occupiers. The Philippine-American War raged until 1902, claiming far more American lives than the conflict with Spain. In the same period, the U.S. formally annexed Hawaii, extending its reach deep into the Pacific. America had emerged as a world power, its flag flying over oceans and colonies far from home. At home, however, the nation hungered for reform. Industrial monopolies, political corruption, and urban squalor had become impossible to ignore. When President McKinley was assassinated in 1901, his young Vice President Theodore Roosevelt, age 43, took office, bursting with energy and moral zeal. Roosevelt saw government as a force for the public good. Using the Sherman Antitrust Act, he shattered monopolies like J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Company, proving that no corporation stood above the law. When coal miners struck in 1902, Roosevelt intervened not with troops, but with negotiation, earning the title of Trustbuster and champion of his square deal, fairness for labor, regulation for business, and preservation of nature. Immigration surged once more. More than 13 million newcomers arrived between 1900 and 1914, overwhelming tenements and fueling the work of reformers like Jane Addams, who founded Hull House in Chicago to aid the poor. Across the country, progressives demanded cleaner cities, safer factories, and honest government. New constitutional amendments reflected this spirit. The 16th graduated income tax and 17th direct election of senators rebalanced power toward the people. Public health laws and zoning boards curbed disease and chaos in urban slums. The temperance movement, led by the Women's Christian Temperance Union and Anti-Saloon League, waged war on alcohol, culminating in the 18th Amendment, 1919, the beginning of Prohibition. Not all reform came from white middle-class activists. In the segregated South, Black communities organized schools, churches, and legal challenges to secure equal rights despite mounting racial terror. Their efforts, though largely unsung, kept alive the unfulfilled promises of Reconstruction. By the dawn of the 20th century, the United States stood transformed, an industrial titan, an emerging empire, and a nation at last aware of its own power. But with that power came responsibility, and soon the world's troubles would call America to the stage once again. The Great Migration and the Great War. As the new century dawned, the promise of equality remained painfully out of reach. The United States entered what historians call the nadir of race relations, a dark age of lynchings, segregation, and Jim Crow laws that stripped African Americans of nearly every gain made during Reconstruction. In response, many fled the South in what became known as the Great Migration. Tens of thousands journeyed northward to Chicago, New York, Cleveland, and Philadelphia in search of dignity and work. Yet even in these cities, racism endured. Across the Midwest and West, sundown towns warned black travelers not to remain overnight under threat of violence. Under President Woodrow Wilson, segregation was reintroduced into federal offices. The 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation, glorified the Ku Klux Klan, reviving it with unprecedented power. By 1924, the Klan claimed 4 million members, influencing legislatures from Indiana to Georgia. White mob violence became common. The Red Summer of 1919 saw bloodshed in more than 36 American cities. Dozens of black men and women were murdered, while states refused to prosecute the killers. Even some progressives, champions of reform in other areas, supported segregation, believing it a solution to racial tension. Southern politicians weaponized the grandfather clause to disenfranchise black voters, restricting the vote to men whose ancestors had voted before 1867, a time when most African Americans were enslaved. Though ruled unconstitutional in 1915, its spirit persisted until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Yet while the black vote was silenced, a new voice was rising, that of American women. Groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and National American Woman Suffrage Association pressed for the ballot, often against bitter opposition. In 1916, Alice Paul founded the National Woman's Party, demanding a constitutional amendment. When the U.S. entered World War I, millions of women stepped into factories, offices, and hospitals, proving their indispensability. On the 18th of August 1920, their struggle triumphed with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. Meanwhile, America's ambitions stretched beyond its borders. Explorers competed for glory at the North Pole. Robert Peary and Frederick Cook both claimed victory in 1909, sparking national debate and political inquiry that remains unresolved even today. Farther south, another triumph of the era reshaped the world: the construction of the Panama Canal, begun by France and taken over by the U.S. In 1904, the project demanded unimaginable labor and sacrifice. Under President Theodore Roosevelt, engineers conquered disease, carved through mountains, and built a system of locks linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. When it opened on the 15th of August 1914, it stood as one of humanity's greatest engineering feats, though more than 5,600 workers perished in its making. That same year, war engulfed Europe. President Wilson vowed neutrality, but the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 and the Zimmermann telegram of 1917, revealing a German plot to ally with Mexico, turned public opinion. On the 6th of April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. The nation mobilized with breathtaking speed. Nearly 5 million men served in uniform, and agencies like the Committee on Public Information stirred patriotic fervor. Women filled factories, grew victory gardens, and worked as nurses and switchboard operators at the front. By 1918, General John J. Pershing's forces, over 1.2 million strong, joined the Allied offensive at Meuse-Argonne, breaking the German line. 26,000 Americans were killed in that campaign alone, but their sacrifice hastened the armistice of the 11th of November, 1918. In Paris, Wilson proposed his 14 points and the creation of a League of Nations, but the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. America turned inward, once more weary, prosperous, and forever changed. The Roaring Twenties followed an age of jazz, innovation, and rebellion when for the first time a majority of Americans lived in cities. Women danced in short skirts, workers earned more and labored less, and the nation seemed to glitter with promise even as shadows gathered beneath the light. The Roaring Twenties and the fall into depression. The 1,920 seconds glittered with promise. Rising incomes and easily available credit turned the decade into a playground of modern indulgence. For the first time, it was socially acceptable to spend and to owe. The nation's total wealth more than doubled between 1,920 and 1,929. Americans flocked to movie palaces to see Charlie Chaplin and Rudolph Valentino, buying over 50 million tickets a week, nearly half the population. Electricity spread rapidly from 16% of households in 1912 to over 60% by the mid-1,920 seconds, powering a new age of comfort. Families filled their homes with washing machines, vacuums, and refrigerators. Radios became the heartbeat of American evenings. By the decade's end, 12 million homes tuned into news, music, and the first live broadcasts. Cars, once a luxury, were now commonplace. The Ford Model T, priced at just $260 in 1924, made mobility affordable to millions. But the glamour of the decade hid deep divides. The top 0.1% of Americans earned as much as the bottom 42% combined. Over 40% of families lived on less than the poverty line. While cities pulsed with prosperity, rural America withered farmers crushed by falling prices and debt. In the cities, freedom danced to a new rhythm jazz. Born in New Orleans and carried north during the Great Migration, it became the soundtrack of a generation. Louis Armstrong, Jelly Roll Morton, and Ethel Waters filled Chicago and Harlem's nightclubs with electric energy. White and black patrons mingled in black and tan clubs, where the night seemed to stretch forever. Yet not everyone celebrated. To moralists, jazz was the devil's music, a corrupting influence from African American culture. By 1927, 100 million jazz records had been sold, most by white bands copying black innovators, even as 60 cities banned jazz from public halls. Meanwhile, the Ku Klux Klan resurged in terror. By 1925, it boasted 5 million members, controlling governments in Indiana, Texas, and Oklahoma, and spreading hate toward blacks, Jews, Catholics, immigrants, and new women. In Tulsa, 1921, white mobs burned the thriving black district of Greenwood to ashes, killing dozens. A wave of nativism swept the nation. The Red Scare hunted communists. The National Origins Act of 1924 all but barred immigration from Eastern Europe and Asia. Prohibition, enacted in 1920, sought to cleanse society by banning alcohol, but it unleashed an empire of crime instead. Speakeasies replaced saloons. There were 30,000 illegal clubs in New York alone. Gangsters like Al Capone grew rich. His Chicago empire earned $60 million a year with police on his payroll. Though drinking-related deaths briefly declined, the experiment failed. As John D. Rockefeller observed, prohibition had created a vast army of lawbreakers. Then the music stopped. On October 24th, 1929 Black Thursday, the stock market collapsed. Fortunes evaporated overnight, factories closed, and the optimism of the Roaring Twenties turned to despair. By 1931, 6 million Americans were jobless. Families lost homes, farms, and hope. Even symbols of ambition like the Empire State Building, begun weeks before the crash, stood nearly empty upon completion, In 1931, a monument to dreams built just before the fall. Across the plains, drought and dust storms ravaged farms from Texas to Nebraska, driving thousands from their land in what became the Dust Bowl. President Herbert Hoover, clinging to ideals of limited government, failed to halt the collapse. By 1932, 15 million Americans were unemployed. That November, voters turned to Franklin D. Roosevelt, whose New Deal would transform the nation. In his first 100 days, Roosevelt's administration revived banks, created jobs, and stabilized industry. The Works Progress Administration put millions to work building schools, roads, bridges, and monuments like Hoover Dam, LaGuardia Airport, and the Bay Bridge. Artists, writers, and musicians found employment in federal art projects. The New Deal also established Social Security, labor protections, and housing reforms, reshaping the relationship between Americans and their government. Critics called it overreach. Supporters called it salvation. By the late 1932, the nation's recovery was fragile but real. Yet across the ocean, another storm was brewing. As war erupted in Europe in 1939, most Americans wished to stay apart, but President Roosevelt knew that isolation could not last. When France fell in 1940, he began quietly arming Britain through the Lend-Lease program, preparing the nation for a fight that would once again change the world. And on a quiet Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, that fight would come to America's shores. World War II, fire, resolve, and a new world order. At dawn on December 7th, 1941, the skies over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, filled with the roar of Japanese warplanes. In minutes, bombs and torpedoes rained down upon the U.S. Pacific Fleet. 3 battleships were destroyed, several others crippled, and over 2,400 Americans killed. Yet, Japan failed in its primary goal. The American aircraft carriers were at sea and spared from the destruction. The attack shocked a nation that had long sought peace. Within a day, the United States declared war on Japan, and soon after, Adolf Hitler declared war on America in turn. The world was once again engulfed in total war. 6 months later, at the Battle of Midway, the tide turned. U.S. intelligence broke Japan's naval codes, leading to a stunning victory that sank 4 Japanese carriers and shattered their naval strength. The triumph at Midway opened the Pacific to the U.S. Navy and paved the way for a brutal campaign of island-by-island assaults. In Europe, the U.S. joined its allied partners, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, to strike back against the Axis powers. To prepare for an assault on Nazi-controlled Europe, the Allies first targeted North Africa. In November 1942, Operation Torch launched massive amphibious landings along the Moroccan and Algerian coasts. American, British, and Free French troops fought fierce battles, but ultimately drove Axis forces from Africa, opening the road to Italy, which fell by 1943. Across the Pacific, U.S. forces began their island-hopping campaign, seizing key positions like Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Each island was a fortress, defended to the death by Japanese soldiers. The cost was staggering, but step by step, the Allies closed in on Japan. Then came June 6th, 1944 D-Day. Under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, France, in Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history. Amid gunfire, blood, and chaos, the Allies gained a foothold in Europe. France was liberated within months, and by winter, Allied troops were pushing toward Germany. In December, Hitler launched his final gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. German tanks smashed through the Ardennes forest, briefly surrounding American forces. But the Allies held. When ordered to surrender, one U.S. commander famously replied, "Nuts." The counterattack broke, and with Soviet forces closing from the east, Germany collapsed. In April 1945, Hitler committed suicide, and soon after, Nazi Germany surrendered. Across the world, in the Pacific, the war raged on. U.S. planners prepared for a deadly invasion of Japan when, on April 12, 1945, President Franklin D. Roosevelt died suddenly. His successor, Harry S. Truman, inherited both the presidency and the Manhattan Project, a secret program to build an atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, the bomber Enola Gay released Little Boy over Hiroshima. In an instant, the city vanished beneath a fireball as hot as the sun. Over 80,000 people were killed instantly. Thousands more died from burns and radiation. 3 days later, Fat Man fell on Nagasaki, killing up to 80,000 more. Facing unimaginable devastation, Japan finally surrendered. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people, "The war was over." In total, over 16 million Americans served in World War II, and 420,000 gave their lives. The conflict ended not only in victory, but in transformation. The United States emerged from the ashes of war as a global superpower, commanding vast military and economic influence. Yet peace brought new tension. Though wartime allies, the United States and the Soviet Union were never true friends. Their competing visions, democracy versus communism, divided the post-war world. By 1949, the Soviets had tested their own atomic bomb, igniting the Cold War. A nuclear arms race began as each superpower built weapons capable of ending civilization itself. By 1952, the U.S. had tested the first hydrogen bomb, 100 times more powerful than those dropped on Japan. The Soviets followed 3 years later. Across the globe, nuclear tests scarred landscapes and lives, while at home, fear of atomic annihilation seeped into American life. Schools held duck-and-cover drills, and families built bomb shelters in their yards. Paranoia deepened with the rise of the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1947, which sought out supposed communist sympathizers. Suspicion, secrecy, and the shadow of the mushroom cloud defined a new era, one not of peace, but of uneasy vigilance. The United States had helped save the world from tyranny and now found itself responsible for leading it through an age of atomic uncertainty, the Cold War, and the long march toward civil rights. In the fearful dawn of the Cold War, America turned inward, suspicious of its own. The House Un-American Activities Committee began rooting out alleged communists from every corner of society. Thousands of federal employees were investigated, some dismissed, others prosecuted, often without evidence. In universities, professors were forced to sign loyalty oaths or testify against their peers. In Hollywood, hundreds of writers, actors, and directors were blacklisted for holding liberal ideas. Their careers were destroyed, their voices silenced. This was the Red Scare, a period of paranoia, later named for its chief crusader, Senator Joseph McCarthy, whose witch hunts defined the era. The Cold War's shadow stretched across continents. In 1961, the Berlin Wall rose, dividing East and West Germany with concrete and wire, a scar through the heart of Europe. The Communist East claimed it protected against Western fascists, but in truth, it caged its own people. West Berlin thrived, while East Berlin starved, and the wall became the most haunting symbol of the global divide. Tensions reached their most perilous point in October 1962, when American spy planes discovered Soviet missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from U.S. shores. The world held its breath. For 13 days, nuclear war seemed inevitable. President John F. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade around the island and demanded the missiles be removed. In a secret exchange, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to withdraw them in return for America's promise not to invade Cuba and to quietly remove its own missiles from Turkey. Disaster was averted, but the world had stood at the brink. The following year, the U.S., Soviet Union, and the U.K. signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the first step toward controlling humanity's deadliest weapons. Yet Cold War conflicts continued to ignite elsewhere. In 1950, Communist North Korea invaded the South. The U.S. intervened under the banner of the United Nations, and 3 years of brutal fighting left 5 million dead, half of them civilians. After Korea came Vietnam. Following the fall of French colonial rule, America stepped in to stop the spread of communism, fearing that if one nation fell, others would follow like dominoes. But the war dragged on, dividing the nation and shattering public faith in government. Presidents came and went: Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, each seeking a way out. Nixon finally pushed for diplomacy, meeting with Soviet and Chinese leaders in 1972 to ease tensions. Arms control agreements followed, but the Cold War flared again in the 1980 seconds under Ronald Reagan, who reignited America's military buildup. Then, almost unexpectedly, the world shifted. In the late 1980 seconds, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in the Soviet Union and began reforms, glasnost, and perestroika that loosened the communist grip. By 1989, walls, both literal and ideological, began to fall. The Berlin Wall was torn down. Nations, once bound by Soviet power, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, embraced democracy. By 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, ending nearly half a century of Cold War tension. But while the nation celebrated victory abroad, it still wrestled with injustice at home. Though the Declaration of Independence had proclaimed that all men are created equal, African Americans continued to live under the cruel legacy of slavery and segregation. The Jim Crow laws of the South kept black citizens from voting, working, or learning freely. The Plessy verse. Ferguson ruling of 1896 had upheld segregation as separate but equal, enshrining racism into law. But a new fight was rising. In 1954, attorney Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP won the landmark case Brown v. Board of Education, which struck down segregation in public schools. Yet victory on paper did not bring peace in the streets. In Montgomery, Alabama, a quiet seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus, sparking a boycott led by Martin Luther King Jr. Their peaceful defiance became a movement, one that would soon shake the conscience of a nation and begin the long, unfinished journey toward equality. Dreams, protests, and the race beyond Earth. By the spring of 1963, the struggle for civil rights had reached a boiling point in Birmingham, Alabama, a city described by Martin Luther King Jr. as the most segregated in America. Under King's leadership, The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, joined forces with the local Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, ACHR, to launch a campaign of nonviolent protest sit-ins, boycotts, and marches to challenge segregation head-on. As Easter approached, demonstrators targeted white-owned businesses, knowing the holiday shopping rush would magnify their impact. Hundreds were arrested. When a state court ordered the protests to stop, the movement defied it. On May 2nd, over 1,000 African American students took to the streets in what became known as the Children's Crusade. Police Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor unleashed fire hoses and police dogs on the young marchers, scenes that stunned the nation. Photographs of children battered by water cannons and bitten by dogs shocked the world, a searing image of America's racial cruelty. The White House, under pressure, sent negotiators to Birmingham. On May 8th, a compromise was reached. The city would remove whites-only signs, release jailed protesters, and begin desegregating businesses. Though not all goals were met, the victory carried a greater meaning. It made Birmingham the epicenter of the national civil rights movement, and it elevated Dr. King to international prominence. 3 months later, on August 28, 1963, more than 250,000 people gathered before the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. There, Dr. King delivered his immortal "I Have a Dream" speech, a soaring vision of racial harmony and justice. The march's message resonated deeply across the country, helping pave the way for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed segregation and discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which protected the right to vote for African Americans. Yet even as the nation celebrated progress at home, it was mired in chaos abroad. In Vietnam, a war meant to stop the spread of communism was consuming lives and dividing the United States. Under President Lyndon B. Johnson, America escalated its involvement, launching Operation Rolling Thunder in 1964, an unrelenting bombing campaign against the North. By 1967, nearly 500,000 U.S. troops were stationed in Vietnam. The war's brutality and futility fueled a growing anti-war movement, with massive protests erupting across college campuses and in the streets. The My Lai massacre of 1968, where American troops killed more than 400 unarmed civilians, further shattered public trust. Protesters clashed with police, draft cards were burned, and faith in government eroded. When Richard Nixon ended the draft in 1972, the damage was already done. In 1975, as helicopters lifted the last Americans from the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, the long, bloody war was finally over, and America's invincibility lay in ruins. But even amid conflict, a different kind of race was being fought, one for the heavens. The space race, born from Cold War rivalry, began in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. The U.S. responded with Explorer 1 and soon established NASA to lead its space ambitions. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy declared, "We choose to go to the moon," igniting a national mission. The Soviets scored early victories, the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, and the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova. But the U.S. surged ahead with the Apollo program. After years of peril and triumph, on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped onto the lunar surface. "That's one small step for man," Armstrong said. one giant leap for mankind. The moon landing marked not just a victory in the Cold War, but a testament to human possibility. What began as a competition for dominance had become a shared vision of exploration. In 1975, American and Soviet astronauts shook hands in orbit, a symbolic end to the space race and a hopeful beginning for cooperation. The innovations born from this rivalry, satellite communications, weather forecasting, GPS, medical imaging, and advanced materials, would shape modern life on Earth. From the streets of Birmingham to the dust of the moon, the 1,960 seconds had proven something enduring about humanity. Even in times of fear, division, and war, people could reach for something higher: justice, peace, and the stars themselves. From postmodernism to pandemic, America in transformation. As the 1,970 seconds dawned, the United States found itself caught between optimism and disillusionment. The horrors of totalitarian ideologies in the 20th century gave rise to a new philosophy, postmodernism, a movement skeptical of universal truths and grand narratives. In universities and art circles, thinkers questioned whether any single story could define humanity. It was a fitting reflection of a society grappling with self-doubt after war, scandal, and social upheaval. The generation that had marched for peace and civil rights in the 1,960 seconds now came of age. Students protested not only the Vietnam War, but also the institutions that upheld old hierarchies. Some protests turned violent, most infamously at Kent State University in 1970, when National Guard troops opened fire, killing 4 students and wounding 9. Yet activism thrived. Young Americans rallied against racism, sexism, and environmental destruction. On April 22, 1970, the first Earth Day was observed, marking a new environmental consciousness. Television and pop culture reshaped the nation's identity. Sitcoms like All in the Family and Saturday Night Live pushed social boundaries, while video games like the Atari 2600 introduced entertainment to living rooms. In garages, dreamers named Jobs and Gates founded Apple and Microsoft, unknowingly planting the seeds of the digital revolution. But beyond the glow of innovation, the decade was turbulent. The 1,973 Arab oil embargo sent gas prices soaring, and a deep recession struck. Political faith shattered with the Watergate scandal, as President Richard Nixon resigned in disgrace in 1974. In his wake came Jimmy Carter, who preached peace and human rights, brokered the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel, and returned the Panama Canal to Panamanian control. Yet the Iran hostage crisis of 1979, when 52 Americans were held captive for 444 days, crippled his presidency and the nation's morale. The election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 ushered in a new era, confident, conservative, and corporate. Reagan promised to restore American strength and prosperity through Reaganomics, a blend of tax cuts, deregulation, and faith in the free market. The economy rebounded for the wealthy, while inequality deepened. Television reflected both the decadence and anxiety of the age, from The Cosby Show and Cheers to grim news reports of crime, famine, and war. In 1986, the nation watched in horror as the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded seconds after launch, killing all 7 aboard. Yet even tragedy could not dim the country's ambition. The U.S. pressed on into space, and on Earth, Reagan's Cold War hawkishness reached new intensity. His administration secretly funneled money to right-wing rebels in Latin America, a scandal known as Iran-Contra. Meanwhile, silence over the emerging AIDS epidemic left thousands to die before the government acted. The decade's other epidemic, crack cocaine, tore through poor urban neighborhoods, fueling violence and mass incarceration. Harsh drug laws disproportionately targeted black communities, turning the war on drugs into a war on poverty itself. When George H.W. Bush took office in 1989, he continued Reagan's policies, but soon faced global crises. The Gulf War of 1991 saw U.S. troops repel Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, securing the Middle East's oil supply. Back home, technology surged forward. Personal computers became household items, and the Internet opened a new frontier. By the late 1990s, the dot-com boom transformed the economy into a gold rush of speculative wealth. Investors poured billions into online startups, sending the Nasdaq up 582%. But when the bubble burst in 2000, $5 trillion vanished, and the economy slid into recession. Still, some survivors, Amazon, Microsoft, eBay, would become titans of the modern world. Then came a new milestone. In 2008, Barack Obama was elected the first African-American president, his message of hope resonating in a nation battered by the Great Recession. Triggered by the housing market collapse, the crisis cost millions their homes and jobs. Obama's administration responded with sweeping financial reforms and stimulus programs to stabilize the economy. But even as the nation recovered, old conflicts endured. The War on Terror, launched after 9/11, dragged into its second decade. In 2016, amid division and disinformation, Donald Trump won the presidency, defying expectations. His populist campaign appealed to disaffected voters but polarized the country. Allegations of foreign interference and rising extremism deepened distrust in democracy. In 2020, a new enemy arrived, the COVID-19 pandemic. Within months, every U.S. state reported infections. Cities locked down, hospitals overflowed, and millions faced unemployment. As fear spread, so too did division over vaccines, government power, and truth itself. That same year, amidst the pandemic's chaos, the nation voted again. Joe Biden defeated Trump in a bitterly contested election marked by mail-in ballots and false claims of fraud. On January 6, 2021, a mob stormed the U.S. Capitol, seeking to overturn the results, an unprecedented attack on American democracy. The certification resumed hours later, and Biden was sworn in as president alongside Kamala Harris, the nation's first female and first black vice president. Biden oversaw the final withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, ending a 20-year war, but leaving chaos as the Taliban swiftly regained control. Then, in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, reigniting tensions between democracy and authoritarianism that echoed the old Cold War. Today, America stands at another crossroads. Its people are weary yet resilient, divided yet bound by a shared past. The nation faces challenges of climate, inequality, and political unrest, but its enduring strength lies in reinvention. From revolution to moon landing, from Watergate to the web, from segregation to spaceflight, the story of the United States is one of struggle and renewal. Across centuries, its people have stumbled, rebuilt, and risen again, propelled by that enduring belief that tomorrow can be better than today. The experiment that began in 1776 still continues, imperfect, defiant, and alive. The American spirit, restless and unyielding, still reaches toward the horizon and, as ever, toward the stars. And that concludes today's journey through time and language. If these stories inspired you, remember, English isn't just a language, it's a living archive of human experience. Every phrase you learn connects you to centuries of courage, discovery, and change. So keep listening, keep feeling, and let history sharpen your English and your understanding of the world. Thank you for joining the MC Time Trackers community. Before you go, like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the past. Until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and keep exploring the epic story of humanity.